Designers do not like to follow directions. They hate structure. And so it's very hard to instruct them on how to do something. And so they're like, oh, yeah, I know you told me to do it, but I'm going to do it this way.
Every time.
Because those rules don't apply to me. And then they struggle and they take twice as long and it's not that good. And so we're always running into these problems.
Hello, everybody. I am back with creative legend, although I learned from the last podcast he does not like being called a legend or a celebrity, but the facts are the facts. Chris Do is here for another conversation that I have no doubt will be full of surprises and genius advice. So if you recall, for our audience, the last episode we were on, which was like for us a year ago, we explored some personal branding chat and the cult of personality, how brand is at its core preference. We talked about Fiji water and all sorts of fun things. Mm-hmm. But today I wanted to dive into maybe some fresh territory, at least fresh for us, the evolution of creative leadership, the role of process in creativity, offline inspiration, and the balance of art and science in design. They are all kind of deep and we may not get to all of them, but that is the goal. So how are you doing? What have you been up to?
I'm doing good. Those topics seem really deep. I'm a little worried about where we're going to go. So I'm excited for that and worried a little bit. I just got back from traveling all over the place. I was in Vietnam, I was in Japan, Dubai, and Singapore recently. And I love it. I'm exhausted, but I love it.
The best kind of exhaustion is travel exhaustion. I am a travel addict, so, it's a good thing. But I'm glad you're here. Hopefully the words come easily and this isn't too deep. If not, we can just keep it chill. So we'll see how this goes. Okay, so let's start by zooming out and looking at the big picture. Creative leadership has gone through a lot of really big changes, especially in the last decade, but you've been in this probably 10 years longer than me, and I've been in this about 24 years this year. So with the rise of personal brands, sort of like meandering over from our last podcast, the gig economy and even like new tools, I'm curious about your take on how leadership has evolved. How do you think the role of creative leaders has evolved over the past decade, especially with the rise of personal brands?
Well, first of all, congratulations to both of us, young spring chickens, for being in business for so long and maintaining our youthful appearance. Let's just take a moment, all right?
We're still loving it, I think, most of the time.
Yeah, I am. Are you?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So when it comes to creative leadership, I don't know the lens in which you're looking at this. You have to give me some context,
okay,
and then I know personal brand, but
for me, creative leadership is anything from what we're doing now, right? We are on podcasts, we are creating content. For all intents and purposes, we are leading creatives in things that they do in some way, shape, or form. But also creative leadership, maybe in, more formal ways, like a creative director in an agency or a senior designer, lead in an in-house sort of position. So just in general, I've been thinking a lot about what it means. I found this old thing that I wrote when I first started that was like, well, as a creative leader, although I don't know if I'm ready to call myself that, this is like a long, long time ago. And I was thinking that kind of term of being a creative leader feels different today to me than it did 10, 15 years ago.
It sounds to me like when you say creative leadership, it sounds like thought leadership, but for creative folk. Like,
yes.
What are we doing to stand out? How are we managing ourselves? How are we casting a vision for the future that can lift up not only the people who work directly, but indirectly with us, right?
Yeah.
So let's just pick up from where we left off last year. I remember a little bit of it, but let's just say now more than ever that your public persona and your private persona have merged more, and it's not going the other direction. And so for the people who I would say like are more old school, traditional designers, they've been bristling against this and they're not ready to accept this reality. But I'm starting to see some of the quote unquote more seasoned folk start to understand the game that's being played right now. And it's just an evolved game. It's not a different game. The old game was you would do incredible work, be published in annuals, speak on a small design circuit, maybe get some press in the trades. And that's how you gained notoriety and established leadership. You might write a book, an article, things like that. And that essential effort and energy hasn't changed, but the platforms in which it appears on has changed. It's given rise to, for lack of a better term, the neophyte creative who's very good on camera or knows how to make content, rising past what I think are the more seasoned, experienced folks that we should be paying attention to. So there's a mismatch here. They're getting a disproportionate amount of attention because they're good on camera, or they've embraced media and they make it as a part of their daily habit. So instead of writing a long form or short form blog post or an article, they are creating content to be consumed by the masses. And the algorithm loves that. The reason why is because they want to make it easier for people to consume, not harder. So when we're talking about an article, it takes time, energy, and effort to like go and read words and like, what do those words mean? And what are the visuals, right? Like we got to read, and it's using more of our brain. So there's a mental processing tax that's happening. Whereas if you read a post online, it's very short. You can scroll through it quite quickly. Then if you keep extending that, well, if you read the words to them, then they don't even have to read and they could just listen. And it turns out a lot of people are more auditory learners. They're listening with their ears versus reading with their eyes. And so there's something else that's happening there. You can feed more people quickly. And so naturally, if you are a content creator in traditional media, you have to learn how to do it in new media, quote unquote, new. It's not that new, obviously. And I think people are finally like letting go. They're relenting to say, you know what, it's here. We accept it. We're not going to crap on people who are doing it. They've learned how to play the game. So here's one thing you could do. Instead of building up your own audience and community, you could just draft on someone else's audience and community. So if someone's really good at making content, right? Somebody's making really good content. Somebody's got a podcast that broadcasts to lots and lots of people. You don't have to make your own podcast. You just be a guest on their podcast. You get value from the exposure of their audience to your ideas. The content creator gets to expose their audience and a community and feed them with great, inspiring thought leaders. And so it's a marriage made in social media heaven. I think that could work really well. And so we're seeing that change. And now we have the additional layer of AI generated content, which has both good and bad components to it. And for the record, for people who are like, "Oh, Chris, are you a champion for AI and screwing over the creative folk?" Yes, I am. But I'm not for screwing over the little folk. The little folk got to get on board. That's all it is. AI can transcribe your meetings. AI can take your verbal diarrhea, translate that into a to-do list or an article that you can share on social. And no one's complaining about that.
Right.
The thing they're complaining about is this quote unquote unethical models that are trained to create images, logos, illustrations, and videos, things that are part of their livelihood. If you were doing the work that a machine can do faster, for cheaper, then you know you're going to be in deep trouble. So rather than fight the machine, use the machine to generate ideas for you, have it enhance things, have it do the grunt work for you, brainstorm with it, use it for the thing it's meant to do, which is to aid you in the expression of your creativity. The one big problem that people usually have with AI generated imagery and content is that it gives the layperson, the non-designer, the non-creative, the ability to make things that rival what they can create. That's the real problem that they're really kind of pushing up against.
Yeah.
So if you can add a layer of sophistication, art direction, pace, then I don't know, maybe you are going to be out of a job.
Anyway.
That's going to be a problem. Yeah. And it's happening whether you like it or not. So let's get on board the train and let's figure out how to use it. And I turn it back over to you.
I agree. So I've seen it, I think, from the beginning as just another tool. There's no reason why we should be afraid of just another piece of technology that can be utilized as a tool. I think that you're right. And if we are afraid of it being able to take over for us, like, we need to think about it in a different perspective. I myself have been using it to kind of brainstorm or use it as a chat, like use it as a coworker that I don't have to say, hey, I have this idea for this thing. Can you poke holes in it for me? Or, things like that, which I think is super valuable. And yes, it would be ideal if we can always use another human for those things. How that relates to me and being a creative leader is being able to kind of see the trends and use those things and lead the way in those areas instead of like trailing behind as the like Luddite, as much as I am like very much an analog meets digital kind of person. I think that is pretty valuable. So thinking about technology, how do you think leaders should balance staying rooted in timeless creative principles while also embracing those tools? For example, how should leaders guide teams in adopting those tools without losing that human touch?
I think it's one thing to prescribe things for your teams to do that you don't actually do. And that's a pretty common practice, right? It's do as I say, not as I do. And I think that's problematic because maybe there are unrealistic expectations as to the quality of the results or how long it takes to do it. And that's often the case when you have someone who doesn't know what the real process is like and dictating to you when things are supposed to be done and how they're supposed to do it. So the best thing a leader can do is to embrace the technologies themselves, to be out in the forefront. Why shouldn't you? Because you have the time. You're not on the production line, if you will. So you should be exploring different tools, comparing, contrasting, reading and researching so that you have enough information to say, look, I'd like for us to use this specific app to do this, to solve this specific problem. And here are some additional resources. So then you have realistic expectations of timeline, resources, and how difficult it is to do. And I'm finding that it's hard for me to go out there and say, oh, AI, use this and that. And they're like, well, what's the use case, bro? And if I don't have an answer for that, then I sound like somebody's just jumping on a bandwagon.
It's like using the phrases your kids use at school, not really knowing what it means.
Yeah, skibbity. You know what I mean?
I wish I didn't, to be honest.
And my kids are like, Dad, you're just not allowed to use it. I'm like, says who? I will use what I want.
I had an entire dinner conversation with my 11 and 16-year-old kids, like literally going, please explain to me what this is. So you mentioned in the last podcast, and we didn't have time to talk about it, but that you are, I don't remember if you said developing your own kind of AI stuff for your team. Would you be willing to share kind of like what sorts of tools you're developing or what kind that you use?
I think maybe even just a year ago, the kinds of things we're doing with AI are around the edge. Now it's integrated into almost everything we do. We use a variety of AI platforms to help us with writing, researching, breaking down things, drawing, creating synopsis for us so that we don't have to literally reread everything that we write. And so that's helping. So let me tell you the couple of technologies that we're using right now that make a lot of sense for us. There is a GPT version that's been trained on our content. It's called Dobot. And Dobot is a version of me. It's a TA. It helps people understand some of the more complicated business concepts because it's been trained specifically on my material. It's been walled off the rest of the internet. So it is a proxy of me. And so it serves some of our communities who have access to it so that you can go and take a course from us and ask Dobot, like, help me reinforce these ideas. What am I missing? And can you explain this differently? Or I'm about to jump on a sales call with a prospect. Let's do some sales role plays together. And it will just do it with you. And I think that's a pretty awesome thing. The people who have used it, who have embraced it, describe it in magical, very human-like ways, which I think is really, really cool. Because I'm a teacher, but as much as I love teaching, I can't be there for everyone at all times. But Dobot can. Dobot can serve all people at the same time, all the time.
That's actually really incredible. So is that something that you developed, or did you kind of take something that already existed and sort of like tweaked it to work for you?
There's a former student of mine, his name is Show Rust, and he runs a company that develops AI engines. He told me I can build one for you. Let's figure out how we need to train it. So previously, I mean, GPT has gone through many iterations since my first touch with it, is he's able to have persistent knowledge being fed to the GPT. So it doesn't forget this course material that it's supposed to be trained on. So it's looked at, I think, 8 modules, numerous follow-up calls, and has synthesized all that. So somebody has gone through the painstaking process of tagging when Chris, I'm speaking, and when it's someone else. And so it's learned, this is Chris's thoughts. Here's how he responds to specific questions. And then second iteration was, it tended to give advice too quickly. I said, well, I would never do that. I would ask you more questions to help you come to some point of self-discovery. And then at the end, I'd summarize it for you. But it's very important for it to behave and talk and think like me.
Wow.
And so it is trained on certain things, and it's a very custom built thing. It's not built on anything else other than GPT.
That's really incredible. It's just a digital Christo coaching app, basically, which is pretty neat. Let's move on. Speaking of leadership, one of the key ways leaders and creatives alike, I think, can make an impact is through their approach to the design process. For you, what's the balance between sticking to a structured process and allowing for spontaneity and creativity in design?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that process and structure is the antithesis of creativity and freedom. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. When we understand like structure of how a home is built, and we can see an infinite variation on that structure, as long as we know it has a roof, it can shed water, and it's designed for very specific purposes. It needs to have a strong foundation and load-bearing walls, those kinds of things. Then it all just works. But imagine if every single time we had to design a house from the ground up and we didn't understand these principles, we'd be fighting against the system and the structure. And I think the same is true about storytelling, like writing a story. Stories follow a very specific formula if you want it to be good. If it doesn't follow a formula, it generally is kind of a hot mess and hard to follow. Enter into Exhibit A, many independent films. We don't know who the characters are. I mean, I used to love them, and I know it's like kind of like a design snobby thing to say, like, oh, it's an independent film, and you're uncouth and unsophisticated, right? But we go and watch those kinds of movies, and I walk away from the theater like, and it usually just ends. I'm like,
what the heck just happened?
Wait, it's over? I don't even know what I'm watching right now. And so it's making us work too hard to decipher meaning, which I think is the intent of a lot of these independent films. The character development, the arcs, all that stuff is just, it's a little bit weird. And then we see a masterpiece like Dune Part 1 and 2, directed by Denis. And I think it's a masterpiece. I'm watching it. It's like, and it's following a very specific formula, told through the lens of a very specific artist visionary. I think that's what's beautiful. So a lot of structure.
Yes.
And then, you know what? In that structure, there's lots of room for creativity. And you can see that in the David Lynch adaptation of Dune versus the Denis Villeneuve's version, based same source material, very different interpretations, right? I love them both. I'm not criticizing one or the other. They're both works of art, and I love both, but they're very different. And I get to enjoy both, luckily, right?
Yes.
And so structure is not a thing for us to fight against. So I'll tell you something. If you woke up tomorrow and you had to design a presentation, and that included writing it, coming up with all the visuals, and you didn't know the structure of how presentations work, it'd be a hot mess. Most of your time would be wasted on building things that didn't work and then redoing it over and over again.
Absolutely.
We know a presentation should start off with like a big opening question, these large, impossible questions to answer, rhetorical questions, and then saying, here's why I really care about this thing. And by the time this is over, I hope to change your mind about X, Y, or Z. And then you go into tell stories and lessons. And that's how it works. And then you summarize. So in closing, I just want you to know this. And you say that. And it's usually a catchphrase. And here are some additional resources. And when you have that in place, then your mind can play within the structure. And I think that's what makes it really cool. So I'm a champion for structure.
I appreciate that. So this is a super self-serving question because I am like a freak for process, design process, creative process. In fact, I have a piece of art that someone bought for me for a birthday one year that said color outside the lines. And I painted right over it and made it say color inside the lines because I fully believe that, you know, once you've got a box to play in and a foundation to build on, that like you can be 1,000,000% more creative. But I love to have guests come on and see what you will say to that because I have talked to a number of creatives, even people that have been doing it as long as us, that still feel like I think they are more in like the I'm an artist category, not realizing the value in, you know, a structure and a process. So when you design, if you design these days, do you want to share what your process looks like?
Yes, I can share. I want to say this thing that the poster that said color outside the lines would not work if there were no lines.
Literally
you do
never
understand
thought about that. But yes, you are so right.
If there's no box to to think outside the box, then we're always thinking outside, or we're inside a really big box where we can't see.
Wow,
So
that just like broke
understanding
my brain.
right? Understanding their structure, knowing when to stay within structure, when to break it, is really important. If we look at music, I took a music history class, so like when I was in college, and it kind of opened my eyes to a couple different things. So if you hear a rhythmic thing like a tap, 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 and it hits every note at a certain point, after a while, it sounds rhythmic. After a longer period, it'll drive you insane. It literally will drive you insane. Hence the whole leaky faucet that taps on a metal surface.
Or the Chinese water torture or whatever.
Yeah. The Chinese water torture. It's just on your forehead.
Yeah.
Consistently will drive you crazy. It'll feel like a hole is being burned through your skin. And in fact, it's not. Conversely, if a cat in an alleyway jumps on the trash can, knocks over a beer bottle or something like that, it's discordant. There's no rhythm or structure. It sounds like noise, which it is. So music is the balance between rhythm and structure and unexpected moments. And I think that's the music that we appreciate. And you'll notice if you listen to really good music, there are certain chord progressions, and then they change, like when they set up a pattern, they change one thing and they come back to the pattern and they go back to the original and then they change it back up again. And it's that slight predictability that becomes unpredictable. And it works.
Music recipe.
Well, it works.
It does.
It's what dominates, right? It's pop, short for popular, versus experimental music, right? Okay. So I like that a lot. When it comes to me in design, the things that I design are social media related or presentation materials. So for social media content, there's a specific process. So I'll describe that because it's simpler. If you want to know how to design presentations, that's a different thing. And let me know.
No,
so
social media is great. Let's do that.
Okay. I'm writing a post, let's say for LinkedIn. LinkedIn is basically text and an image. An image is 4:5, right? 4 inches by 5 inches, or 4:5 aspect ratio. I'm sitting there looking at the story like as if I was now a designer for an article in a magazine. I think to myself, what is the visual that's going to go with this that not only grabs your attention, but pays off somehow in the story itself? Because otherwise it's a total non sequitur. Image and story have no connection. And I'm a big believer in semiotics. This plus that equals something more, right? So image plus text equals something more. The sum of the parts, or the whole, is greater than the sum of the parts. And so I sit there and like, okay, what am I going to do? And usually I'm looking for theme and a word. And the word I think of isn't always visual, and it isn't always something I can find a metaphor for. So I'll go on Shutterstock and I'll type in that word. And it's like, no, this is not what I'm looking for. What else could it be? So sometimes Shutterstock shows me the quote unquote the wrong image. I'm like, oh, I didn't think of it like that. Let's say it showed me a shovel and I wasn't looking for a shovel. So I click on the shovel, I'm looking at it. And then what I do is I twirl down and I look at all the keywords that someone put in the meta tags to describe that thing. I'm like, that's the word I'm looking for. It's called surfacing or digging. And so when I put that word back in, then it gives me a bunch of images that are more thematically linked with what it is that I want to do. So I'll usually grab that image, I'll pull it down, but the image is not going to be what I had in my mind. Let's say I wanted a shovel, but I wanted to shape it in like an infinity symbol. The old me would go into Photoshop and slowly do envelope distort and get that thing to start, but the lighting's jacked and the textures are not.
Everything's jacked.
Hours doing that. Okay. Now what I do is I go on to Midjourney. I'll type in rustic, shovel, antique, patinaed, kind of heavy wood grain on a black background, studio photography, something like that. It'll generate a bunch of images. And oftentimes it's like, oh, that's beautiful. That's what I want to use. I still have the dilemma. It doesn't look like an infinity symbol. I'll take that. I'll go into Illustrator. I'll draw an infinity symbol roughly with the shovel head. I'll take that and bring it into Firefly, feed it the reference image of the shovel, feed it the structure image of the infinity symbol, put those two and type it in and then hit enter. And it most likely will produce something that would have taken me hours to do in minutes. And it's like, that's really good. Upscale that, take it down, go add some additional type, put the finishing touches on it, color correct it, and Bob's your uncle.
Let's think about that. I often talk about my process and the fact that my process always starts with words and coming up with concepts via a word map. I don't even touch the computer for any reason whatsoever, except, maybe if you consider my phone a version of a computer, just to use a thesaurus to help me find, the right words. I don't even get on to look for images until I have like a full plan, a full concept with visuals and colors and typefaces and all of that. And I often will talk about it with people very similar to how you just did. Like, here's what you do. Here's first, second, third. This is the way it works. But I sometimes get pushback from creatives that are like, no, I have my own process. Like, I get stuck a lot, but it's fine. No matter what level of experience you have, if you're finding as a creative that your current process isn't really yielding the results that you want, do you think that creatives would be well served to adapt someone else's process kind of as is, or use it more as like a framework to morph and meld into like their own thing?
I'll give you an analog to this, and then I think it'll answer itself. If it doesn't, hold my feet to the fire and see what happens. Let's say you're a home cook, chef, and you're trying to make something you've never made before, something delicious. There's a dinner party that you want to impress people, and you try and figure it out. You have some experience. It's not like you don't know what you're doing. You put it together, and it just doesn't taste right. The meat's dry. The vegetables are overcooked, and they've lost their color. Well, someone else has done this dish before. It may not be the exact same dish, and they wrote a cookbook, and there's something called the recipe. And if you follow that recipe, cook this for this long, here are all the ingredients, and you do your best to follow the recipe, you're going to come pretty close to the way that the photo turned out and the way that you imagined it to taste. So if you're not willing to learn someone else's recipe, then you are left to explore and waste a lot of food, waste a lot of time, maybe get your hand burned on the stove. I like to just learn someone else's recipe, someone that I like, and the flavor profile is good. And then when you've done it enough times, then you can change the ingredients. Like, you run out of something, you try something else, but you know what works and you know what each component does. So if you like the work you're doing, develop your own recipe, teach other people, sell the recipe if you want. And if you don't like what you're doing, go borrow someone else's recipe.
Chris, listen, have you been
Yes.
eavesdropping? Were you at my presentation just talking about how a lot of designers approach their work like a baker who just wants to bake something cool and throws it together without a recipe, and talking about the creative recipes and the importance of that? So, man, just same wavelength here. I do think that you leveled it up a bit on saying that taking someone else's recipe that already knows what they're doing is never a bad idea. Now, I don't know why I use cooking metaphors, because I hate cooking, but I constantly skip steps in the process of creating things I have to eat, but never in the design process. So in regards to that, what do you think are the biggest mistakes that you see designers making when they try to implement a process, whether it's from other people or on their own?
Yeah. Before I answer that question, and I might forget by the time I finish, I want to tell you a little story, okay?
I love stories.
Okay. And we'll keep it along the recipe and cooking thing.
Let's do it.
Okay. My mom is an amazing cook. So is my dad, actually.
All moms except for this one sitting here right now.
When we fled Vietnam and came to the United States, it was a culture shock. There's lots of things we didn't understand. Ingredients. Like, I'm like, who uses butter? What is butter for? Like, what are we doing with toast? I don't understand this stuff. But eventually we kind of acclimate, and then my mom wants to make some quote unquote American dishes. So one day she decides, I'm going to make spaghetti. Look good in the magazine, Sunset magazine, and I'll make it for you. And my mom's cooking and everything. And then I see what she's doing. And I'm like, Mom, why are you pouring fish sauce into the tomato sauce? She goes, because it needs seasoning. I'm like, I don't think the Italians or the Sicilians or whoever invented this had access to fish sauce, and they wouldn't have used it. She goes, it's going to be fine. So, and this is a common immigrant story, right? It's like substituting ingredients when you don't even understand the original thing. For our palate, it tasted fine. But later on, when you have like authentic Italian food from a respectable place, it doesn't taste the same. It's not even close. And so you're like, that's the original flavor profile. We probably should start there before we go into doing variations. And this leads me, yes, accidental fusion. This leads me to the whole, what are some of the biggest problems that designers have? Designers do not like to follow directions. They hate structure. And so it's very hard to instruct them on how to do something. And so they're like, oh, yeah, I know you told me to do it, but I'm going to do it this way.
Every time.
Because those rules don't apply to me. And then they struggle, and they take twice as long, and it's not that good. And so we're always running into these problems. And I think it's because we have this romantic idea about what creativity is. It's like somewhere streamed from the heavens, from the universe, the energy in the room. I feel what I feel. I'll do what I do, and it'll get done when it gets done. And it's magic because it makes us feel like we're magical because we produce magic. But what if we just said everyone can do this? And if we follow certain principles of design, that most of us are going to be better designers than some of us are, right? So it kind of conflicts with this idea that I'm a magical creature. I'm channeling the universe.
I am a unicorn.
Yeah. And I don't want to pop your bubble, but I'm pretty sure I can teach a bunch of like construction workers on how to design because I understand design formulas. I understand structure. And if they're willing and they have an open mind, I can teach them how to be a pretty good designer. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, every human that exists is creative.
Yeah. I agree with you. Everybody's creative, but we don't all have the same ability to see a future that hasn't materialized yet. So something I picked up from my friend Brian Collins, who says designers are futurists. We imagine possible futures and multiple futures, and we pick the most optimal one, right? So we're imagining a future state, and we made a bunch of decisions. Like if I pick this color and that typeface, what does the end result look like sometime into the future? And we try these ideas out in our mind before we actually execute anything. So the gap between where we are and this imagined future is kind of the degree of creativity that you have. So I have friends, they work in the creative space, and one thing they really struggle with is personal style, like fashion. And so we'll go shopping together and I'll say, try this. Like, no, that's terrible. No, that's not good. That's not me. It's not me. I can't see myself doing that, right? And I said, I'm telling you it's good. And if you're asking for my advice on what to buy, which they are, I say, but go buy this right now. They don't do it. And then sometimes I buy what I told them to buy because I'm not picking out stuff I don't want. I'm picking out stuff that I want, but I don't want to buy right now. But for you, it's great. And then I buy it. And then they see me use it and work with it. They're like, you make that work. It worked when I told you to buy it. It didn't change. What changes, I closed the imagination gap for you by literally executing it and showing you how it works. That's the imagination gap I'm talking about. They could not see it on themselves. They didn't try. And they couldn't see it on anybody else because of their lack of imagination. But once they saw it on another person, then they are now understanding and appreciative of it. And I want to point something out. I think in a documentary called Becoming Ralph, the story of Ralph Lauren, there was an innovative thing that he did. Now, Ralph Lauren is not a fashion designer. He doesn't know how to make clothes. He doesn't know how to draw. But he kind of put together combinations from different pieces that he would buy, either in the thrift store or whatever. And people took note. So eventually he launched his own fashion line. And one of his great innovations is, prior to this, I didn't know it was him. People would just have clothes on a rack or on a mannequin. But what Ralph did was he created a scene. So if it was for like an adventurous couple traveling to a faraway place in Africa, he would have trunks, like suitcase trunks, and then he would use props to tell the story. So they credit him as one of the first people to set up these vignettes that when you walk through the store, like, whoa, it's not just the clothes. There's a vibe and they're doing something.
Telling a story with
telling a story. They're holding a book. They're not selling books, but they must be educated or they're going to play golf later or polo or something. Something's going on here, right? And so that closes the imagination gap. So one thing we all can do is to close the imagination gap for those that lack this skill, for your clients, for your employees or your staff, for your boss, because we don't understand it. And luckily you have the skills to do this. So the way we do this with clients is this: don't ask them to pick a logo that you just designed. Put the logo in context, put it on a uniform, put it on a building, put it on lots of things. Let them see how this logo is going to apply, because you see that future, but they can't see it. Think about other applications, maybe a tote bag or a book or something else that they're like, we would never use that, but it's telling a really interesting story.
Yeah, I love that. I think that, man, the imagination gap thing is huge. And it was a game changer for me years ago when I started actually showing, the rebrand in action instead of just like, here's the logo and all its variations. Do you like it? ? Yes or no? And I think that that's really important because it does tell the story of the brand in the real world. But I wanted to dive into something I'm really passionate about, if process isn't enough. It's like process and inspiration are like the epitome for me as a designer. I want to talk about offline inspiration and breaking free from the so-called digital echo chamber. Do you agree that easy access inspiration on platforms like Pinterest and Behance leads to derivative or homogenized work? And if so, how do you encourage designers to break free from this echo chamber?
I think, first of all, we all need to let go of this idea of originality. I think it's a lofty standard to hold yourself to, and one that is very rarely achieved. And when people say that looks really original, what they're not saying is, I've never seen it before. Congratulations. You're such an innovative visionary. You're going to set the world on fire. What they're saying when they're like, that is a very original idea, is that you're borrowing from sources that are unexpected to them. And that's usually the extent of originality. Mm-hmm. Originality comes usually in the space of technology, where you're able to express something using technology that hadn't been possible for. So when we have macro photography lenses, we can zoom in on something and show people like what the texture of a fly looks like that they could not see with the normal eye, right? Yeah. And so that you're using technology to show me something new that was original at one point. And it's becoming harder and harder to do that because there's less and less innovative things happening in terms of technology. So what we're trying to do is to find a source material that isn't overused so that it doesn't become derivative. The easy example I would say is when you're on social media and someone uses a typeface and a color and it's on Instagram, what usually happens is people then use the same color, same typeface. And you're like, ooh, not very original, very derivative. And they'll call you out on social, like, oh, XYZ was doing this, and now you're doing it.
I already saw this before.
Right? But this is how trends start on social. One person does it, another person does it, and more. It's the same thing if you hear like a cool trending song, and you're like, oh, yeah, I didn't recall that song, but now I see it used, and next reel you post has the exact same song.
Yeah.
Not generally a problem, but in the visual space, that's a problem because people expect designers to make things.
Differentiate.
Yeah, make something a little bit different, right? So that's when it becomes really derivative. But when you're on Pinterest, I think there's hundreds of millions, if not million or billions of images. So how you arrive at an image is largely dependent on your surfing history, your browse history, and the way that you pin boards and who you follow and connect with and how many things you've hearted. And so if you and I were to type in the same words, we'd probably come up with slightly different palettes. And what's more interesting is once you touch an image, it leads you down a rabbit hole of more and more images, right? And so what you wind up referencing may have nothing to do with where you started, which is cool, or have anything to do with what I think is appropriate for this thing too. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Back in the day, I remember my friends, they ran a production company and they did this video for Money Mark. And everyone's like, wow, that's so cool. It's so original. And it was so fresh. And then when you knew the source material that they were referencing, it took some of the luster off that. So one of the business partners there, he's half Thai, like from Thailand. And so he had all these old, what they call the secret sources, like magazines from Thailand. So it had a distinctive typeface, colors, photography, and just the way they designed everything. So they just borrowed heavily from those Thai magazines in the layout and the composition. Most of us didn't have access to it, nor were we familiar with the reference point. So when we saw it, it was like, whoa, really cool, fresh, different, and original. None of that was true. So it's our ability to hide sources is originality. And I think that's a quote from Einstein or Picasso or somebody very famous and smart, right?
Someone famous said it.
Yeah.
Yes, I've heard it before.
The thing is, you don't want to go and regurgitate from the same pool of references. Go outside your industry. Go to different timelines. Go to something deep in the past, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Pull that out and bring that into your visual palette. And then people are like, well, that's pretty cool. That's quite interesting.
Yeah. And I agree with this to some degree. I will push back a little bit because I think that the way you and I would use Pinterest is probably leaps and bounds away from how, and I say this based on a lot of people I've interacted with, younger designers, especially in recent years, say the past like 5 to 10 years, how they are using Pinterest does often leave them with derivative work because they aren't digging deep enough, or they don't enter that space with the right mindset or with like a clear concept in mind. They are going in going, I need to design a poster for this band. I'm just going to look up band posters. And then it does start to all look the same. I think you're kind of making my point for me in a different way. I always urge people to get offline first and look for inspiration, like in the world around you and maybe in more analog places, because that's where people aren't looking as much. By your friend kind of looking at like old magazines and stuff, even though we are in a world of technology, there's still loads and loads of inspiration that aren't online. I think it's sort of a fine line to walk. As soon as you open up your computer to search for inspiration, you're not letting your brain mix its own like creative soup by engaging with the things that you find inspiring to you. Like whether you like comic books, I'm really interested in travel. I'm a huge Tolkien fan and Alice in Wonderland, and I like things layered, and that shows up in my work because that's the kind of things I'm interested in. I have lots of things pinned on Pinterest, but when I'm looking for a client specifically, that is not the first place I go. And very rarely do I go there at all. And that might just be me, but it is something that I've seen as, a challenge for other creatives. It's like, oh, I can't think of anything cool or new. Well, where are you finding your inspiration?
Well, I'm going to push back on your pushback.
Let's do it.
Okay. I don't think that Time Magazine is any different than finding it online. And I think if people are lazy and want to take shortcuts and do superficial work, they're lazy, they take shortcuts, and they are superficial. There's nothing that you and I will say or do that will change their mind.
I just want them to be better than that.
Well, let me ask you this question. Usually when people want something for somebody else, they're usually avoiding their own problem. Usually when I'm coaching people, like, why doesn't my team do this? What is it that you could focus on doing that you can change in your life? Spend your time and energy there. I don't really get involved with like, why do people do what they do? They do what they do. I don't have time for that, because every unit of energy I use worrying about what they do, telling them to fix it, is time and units of energy away from what I should be doing. So I've done this, right? And people will have credited me in the past for starting a very particular aesthetic and design style on Instagram, which then was rippled and copied a lot. And I don't care. I'm doing my own thing. I look at it like there's a spear. I want to be at the tip of the spear. I don't want to be the butt of the spear.
Right.
So some people are at the butt. And I get that. And I don't really care. So what happens is they're trying to establish their own identity, their own leadership, and they're not doing that by the action that they take. It makes no sense to me. So what I do is like, I'm at the tip of the spear. What else am I going to do? I'm going to keep changing the aesthetic. I'm going to keep evolving. I'll use garish colors that they won't know how to use, right? And quite literally what happens is I tried to pick the two ugliest colors I can find.
Chartreuse.
I love chartreuse and I'll use that. I wouldn't consider that one, but I use this kind of like salmony pink color. So it's not pink like cool, but it's not red. Mm-hmm. It's kind of this weird salmon pink color. And then paired it up with the sage forest green, which is also very difficult to use because it doesn't have a lot of pop to it. Chromatically, it's very close to black or like a gray, right? Mm. And before I was using bright colors and like poppy things that would make sense. And then sure enough, I can see the butt of the spear using the same color briefly and just crashing horribly. And you can see in their posts, they tried a couple, like it's all like, let's say this is an example, black, yellow all the time. And then pink. Wait a minute. You try and do this thing and you see like 2 or 3 posts with this kind of salmony color, and then they can't make it work because it requires more skill than they possess. And I feel like I'm trolling people because I know they're going to copy. So I'll throw out weird things. So people who know how to design will use quote unquote ugly typefaces, colors, and techniques, but they'll still make it work. Much more difficult for people to copy. So I don't really put any of my energies there, right? So in the pre-internet age, access to information and visuals was a real thing, because if we weren't close to a library that had great books and magazines, and we weren't in a metropolitan city, well, that's all you got, especially if you hadn't traveled. But the friend who directed this music video, he's half Thai. So this is what he grew up with. And everybody in Thailand's like, we've been doing this for decades, bro. This ain't innovative at all.
Yeah.
So you see what I'm saying? Like,
yes.
It doesn't matter if your source is analog. It's like, what is your intention? And that's not for me to sit around and watch because I don't really care. If I like something, I like it. And some people are like, well, that's derivative. Well, says who? Everything you do is derivative. Everything I do is derivative. So what are we talking about? Like, you like layered things. I can show you 100 layered things that happened before you.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So usually what I tell people is when a person points their finger and says that's very derivative and they're like, my work isn't, that's a sign of arrogance and ignorance. And I wrote about this in my book, right? When you think you're so good, your work's original, I think that's arrogance. And you think everyone else is ripping things off, like, wow, you're so special, huh? I bet your poop don't stink either. And number two, I say you're ignorant because you have no sense of history. So I'll show you where your stuff comes from because my sense of history is deeper than yours. And then all of a sudden, I don't want to pop your bubble, but you ain't that original either. Mm-hmm. So we want to cast stones because we're avoiding a conversation with ourselves. And we put our head in the sand because if we look deeper, we'll realize nothing we do is original. And in fact, it's worse than the original, which is a travesty in itself. So let's embrace all the sources and the resources. Let's go outside of the typical places and let's try to find unique, interesting takes on it, which becomes original. Tracy Chapman wrote this beautiful song called Fast Car. Do you remember it when it was on the radio?
I probably know it if I heard it. It doesn't ring a bell off title alone.
Yeah, it's a kind of a folksy, beautiful song. Right?
I know Tracy Chapman, so I'm sure that I'm
good story. It's like her number one hit. So if you know Tracy, it's got to be that same song.
I just don't know the title.
And then recently, I think there's a country musician. I think his name is Travis. He sings Fast Car, and then a country audience loves it, not realizing it was a black woman who wrote and sang the original song. And so then the country singer with Tracy Chapman appears on stage and does a duet, and people are like losing their mind. Old schoolers like me and new schoolers who are into country see them working on this thing. And it's pretty cool. Travis, I don't know his name. The country music singer did not write the song. He didn't even perform it differently. He just put a country twang on it. But that's enough for it to be original. But by honoring and citing the source, Tracy Chapman's song got played a lot more, became a trending song, and she's been invisible for decades, and all of a sudden she comes back out again. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so that's really amazing.
Bad habit, you don't look outside. Bad habit, bad manners is you rip things off without citing sources, which is problematic. So don't do those two things and you're good.
Yeah. Well, and I think we're probably more aligned on this than might appear at first glance, because it's less about originality and more about me encouraging designers to use their inspiration differently than other people and find inspiration in places where most people aren't looking, because it is easier to make something that just is a direct copy of someone else's work if that's all you're consuming all of the time. I agree that not anything is original, and the best things, some of my favorite things are the things that are a mixture of X and Y to make this cool new thing.
Mashups.
So, yes, absolutely. Mashups, especially music. I love mashups.
Well, we're kind of shocked to discover this very popular song that we love was sampled from this other song that we didn't know existed.
Every time. I do it to my kids now. My parents did it to me, and it's a whole thing.
Yeah.
So are there places that you specifically look that are unusual in the sense of like, I'm looking for some inspiration for X product or project or presentation, social media? Are you primarily looking online, or do you like have other things that you really have often found like, oh, that was really cool that I just encountered?
There's a couple of places. I don't know if you can tell, but I have a couple of books.
Yeah, me too.
And so I like to buy books, right? And I don't think there's a term for it. I don't know the term, but some people have a visual photographic memory. I don't have a photographic memory, but it's pretty freaking good. It doesn't forget visuals. So I look at things. I might scan a book at a bookstore, buy the book, and never look at the book again. But I'm like, okay, catalog, remember, and see if this ever comes up. Mm-hmm. And we're being bombarded with images on social anyways, with really beautiful, diverse work from all over the world, different people of different ages and cultural backgrounds. And I think that's really cool. So now we're absorbing even more information. So I don't find the need to find inspiration so much as I did when I was like 19 years old. And finding inspiration is code word for like, I got to find something to rip off. Let's just be real about it.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what I do, I draw inspiration or spark from non-design design things. I'm looking where people aren't looking, quite literally, on the bottom of boxes, on the like a sticker that's been taped to something because it was falling apart. There's a hole in the ground. People will spray paint graphics on it. What I love looking at, and it's really weird, sewer covers or
oh my gosh, I
utility
love
covers,
those.
right? From
I've
different
heard that
cities.
they have some really incredible ones in Asia. You would have to tell
Everywhere
me.
in the world you go. Okay. So they serve a couple of purposes. Number one is they're metal. So when it rains, it's slippery. So they usually have a texture on it. This is kind of important. And then if it's a certain city or it's there's a communication there that I don't fully understand because there's numbers and letters and certain patterns that's reflective of the culture. So if you see a pattern in Taiwan, it's different than the one in Sweden. So every time I walk past, I'm like, oh, that one's kind of interesting. I'll take a picture of it. I'm just mesmerized by the thick, bold, chunky lines and graphics that are included because they translate. It'll look good as a logo. It'll look good as a texture. And
It's
it'll
basically
look
a
good
badge logo.
Pretty much in a unique shape, right? They're not always the same shape. Or I'll look at, what is it called? The numbers on buildings where it's like a multi-unit dwelling.
Oh, yeah.
So in Germany, it's going to be different. And in London, it's going to be different. In America, it's going to be different. So I kind of just am fascinated by patterns, color blocking, typefaces that, there's a 3AB in a circle here because it says something. I don't understand what it says, but the spacing is really, really cool. I just like that. So I photograph those kinds of things. And my wife, she'll say this every single time. We're walking around and I'll say, stop guys, hold on. Okay, we can go.
Yeah.
And she's like, what'd you just do? And she would just walk over, look down there. And she's like, wow. And she says to my boys, your dad always has the sharpest eye for cool things. 1,000 people walk by here. They never noticed, but your dad's going to find the one cool thing here. And I don't know what I'm going to do with that kind of stuff, but I'm fascinated by non-design design. The things that you find in a fire escape, the thing that you might find on fire extinguisher canister with a punch card from the fire department. Those things fascinate me.
Yes. So this is what I would like to call uncommon inspiration. I am very much the same way. I don't know. My kids and my husband are they're basically super used to me doing embarrassing things to catch like something I just saw. Is that your primary way of like capturing and cataloging that like personal inspiration is like on your phone? Or are you also one of those people that likes to live sketch something that you just saw to kind of keep that for later?
I mostly just capture on my phone. I don't always carry a notebook, but I don't feel the need to live sketch.
Yeah, me
but
neither.
I'll tell you
Just
something.
Curious.
Sometimes what you missee is more interesting than what you really see. So I walked into an elevator, and the way that the mirrors were set up, they were smoked, and there was like it was beveled in a certain way, so it diffracted the image. So I walked in there, seeing my shirt that I normally don't look at that way, with the layered shirt on top, and the way it was diffracted in the mirror. I'm like, it gave me an idea that I hadn't seen before because the shirt was cropped and was distorted in the mirror. So then I pulled out a 3x5 index card and I just sketched it out. I'm like, that's pretty cool. I'll just save it for later. My biggest problem is too many ideas, not enough time, not enough execution, right?
Yeah, just save it for later. Later will come, right?
Later's like, I'm 98. I'm like, oh yeah, where's that idea? There it is.
That I saw in Japan that one day.
Yeah.
The idea of seeking inspiration, especially in the real world, kind of leads to another big topic that I hope we still have time for.
Okay, let's do this.
Okay.
Let's end on a big, deep one, and then I'm about to fall over.
Okay, this
Let's
is the
do this
last.
one.
This is the last one. This is all about balancing art and science and design. Designers were always sort of toggling necessarily between the analytical and the emotional sort of creative side. I know, obviously, I rely on both in my work. I also believe that we can't actually really tap into good design solutions until we realize that we're always going back and forth between, the science and the artistic side. So you've mentioned the importance of data-driven design in the past. How do you personally reconcile the analytical side of design with the intuitive, emotional, or creative side?
Well, if we're talking about design is supposed to solve a problem. So oftentimes we start designing without a clear definition of the problem we're trying to solve. And I think we want to do this because accountability sucks. Nobody wants to be accountable for anything, right? So we say, oh, yeah, this will help your brand. We're like, well, what do we mean when we say that? Are you going to put Are you going to drive more traffic to the store? Is this going to drive more traffic to the website? It's going to help with conversion. Is it going to be shared more on social? We don't know. And we prefer not to know. But then we have to admit to ourselves at some point that design was just an expression of an idea, an art form, and not actually solving any real problems. I prefer to say, like, let's solve a problem. And I got off a phone call yesterday, off a Zoom call, where they gave us analytics. And they said, okay, here's how many click-throughs, here's how many people wanted on the site, and here's how many downloads we got. Here's where we are with the benchmarks we set. We're performing really well here. We're massively underperforming here. And so then it's got my mind thinking. Instead of just throwing out another creative idea, I have to find an idea that might have a better shot of solving this problem. And the same is true about YouTube. Like, I'll make a thumbnail. I'm like, that's a piece of art right there, a chef's kiss. Amazing. And you use it, and then you realize no one is clicking through. And we've done this many, many times so that I know change the thumbnail, change the whole performance of the video. So design there has a direct implication to the analytics that you're going to see, the number of people who watch it, the number of people who will be influenced, and the minds that will change. And if you can't package it correctly, no minds will change, no one will see it. So packaging matters a lot there, and you have real data. So over time, we start to realize certain patterns, like a certain face looking this way, doing this with this kind of puzzle within the image itself, relative to the headline, is usually the highest performing thing. The danger of that is all the thumbnails start looking the same in terms of following a specific formula. So what I caution people to do is, you found one way it works. It's not the only way that it works. So it's important for you to try lots of different things and keep doing this, because you'll find another way, and you'll discover more than one way can work, and it gives you enough variety to do that. So don't be so quick to zero in on something because it's worked a couple of times to say, I'm not going to explore anymore. First of all, life is not fun that way. But you're really closing too many doors that you haven't yet opened.
So do you think then that is the risk in relying too heavily on data from a design standpoint, is like, leaning too far to the analytical side and going, well, this worked, so why don't we just keep doing that?
Yeah. And, they say that data and science and truth isn't all data, science, and truth. If you and I conducted a poll and we got all this data and statistics, depending on our biases and our agenda, we can read the data and we can tell a very different story. So you could focus on the 67% of people who do something, and I can focus on the 33% who don't do that thing. And it tells a very, very different story, right? So we have to be careful to say, like, data is just a jumping off point. We have to factor in biases and whatever agenda we might have.
It's almost like I see it glass half full, you see it glass half empty. Sort of.
Yes, but in a more polarizing way than that even.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
like, you could see the glass half empty and say, we're going through massive climate change. I predict drought. There's a lot more that you can do than that.
Yes.
And I can see the glass half full and say, well, this is full of impurities and toxins and things like that that'll destroy our life.
Look at us going all full circle back to our conversation about water the last time.
There we are.
So I'm going to go easy on you and let you go. But I had a couple of easy lightning round questions.
Let's do it. Oh, we'll do it right now.
Okay, let's do it. What music are you listening to right now?
I'm probably enjoying 21 Pilots, Frank Ocean, and who else? Let's just stop there.
Okay, those are great picks. What book are you reading, or books are you reading right now?
I'm going to try to finish The 4 Conversations, a new book by Blair Enns. I believe it's his 3rd book.
Okay.
Yep.
What's the one city you always return to for inspiration, and what about it sparks your creativity?
I think Japan. Japan has such a unique, diverse culture. They have their own sense of original ideas, but also they reference a lot of things from America, but they put a very Japanese twist on it. I don't think Japanese people cannot not do that. They're so influenced by their culture that everything they do has a certain Japanese quality to it. So everything from their sense of fashion, food, city planning, wayfinding, and their thoughtfulness, it inspires me.
I love that. I think I need to look into that culture a bit more after this conversation.
You'll love it.
If you could have dinner with any designer, this is the last one, dead or alive, who would it be? Assuming it's someone you haven't already had dinner with.
I would probably say Johnny Ive. He's alive. He's no longer with Apple officially, but I'm curious to hear his stories about what it was like to shape this company that was struggling to make it to becoming one of the world's most valuable companies.
From a designer standpoint inside that company. That
Yeah,
would be
I want to hear
very,
all the
very
dirty stories, spill the
Yeah.
tea.
Awesome. Well, Chris, man, this was a lot. And I appreciate your time as always. I hope it was as intellectually stimulating for you as it was for me. And I think you probably need to go have some water and take a nap and recover from all of your travels.
Yes. Thank you very much for having me again.
Thank you so much. We'll talk again soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.